On March 1, 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific that was 3 times more powerful than expected. The blast vaporized an entire island and sent a cloud of radioactive ash across the Marshall Islands, covering families who had no idea what was happening to them. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. The U.S. didn't evacuate these people for 3 days, and when they finally did, they immediately launched something called Project 4.1, a medical research program designed to study what radiation does to human beings over decades. The question that haunts this story isn't just what happened to the Marshall Islanders, it's whether they were left in that radioactive hell on purpose. To understand the magnitude of what happened in the Marshall Islands, you need to picture the most remote corner of the Pacific Ocean. A chain of coral atolls so isolated that most Americans couldn't find them on a map. Between 1946 and 1958, this peaceful corner of paradise became the United States' primary nuclear testing ground. 67 atmospheric nuclear tests turned these islands into what officials called the Pacific Proving Ground. But the residents called it something else entirely. They called it the end of their world. The tests started small, relatively speaking. The 1946 Operation Crossroads tests at Bikini Atoll displaced the local population, but were contained affairs. The residents were moved away before the bombs went off. The fallout was manageable. The international attention was focused elsewhere. But as the Cold War heated up and the U.S. raced to develop hydrogen bombs, the tests grew larger and more dangerous. Everything changed on March 1, 1954, with a test codenamed Castle Bravo. The scientists expected a yield of about 5 megatons. They got 15 megatons instead. The bomb was 3 times more powerful than predicted, making it the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by the United States. The fireball alone was nearly 4 miles wide. The mushroom cloud reached 25 miles high and 100 miles wide. But the real disaster wasn't the size of the explosion. It was what happened next. The wind was supposed to blow the radioactive fallout away from inhabited areas. Instead, it shifted and carried a deadly cloud of contaminated coral dust directly over populated atolls. Rongelap, Eilingine, Utirik, and Rongerik were all in the path of this radioactive snowfall. The residents watched white ash fall from the sky like snow. Children played in it. Adults brushed it off their skin, not knowing they were handling some of the most dangerous material on Earth. The people of Rongelap received the highest doses. Within hours, they were experiencing acute radiation sickness. Hair began falling out in clumps. Skin developed severe burns that looked like chemical burns. Nausea and vomiting swept through entire communities. Children cried as their skin peeled away in sheets. The residents had no idea what was happening to them or why. But here's what makes this story so controversial. The U.S. military knew about the fallout within hours of the blast. Weather monitoring stations tracked the radioactive cloud as it moved across the inhabited atolls. Radiation detectors showed dangerous levels of contamination. Yet evacuations didn't begin until March 3rd and 4th. That's 2 to 3 days after people were exposed to lethal amounts of radiation. Why the delay? Official explanations cite logistical challenges and weather conditions, but declassified documents reveal something more troubling. Within days of the Castle Bravo disaster, the U.S. launched Project 4.1, officially titled Study of Response of Human Beings Exposed to Significant Beta and Gamma Radiation Due to Fallout from High-Yield Weapons. The timing wasn't coincidental. This was a ready-made opportunity to study radiation effects on human populations. The project began immediately. Medical teams from Brookhaven National Laboratory and other institutions descended on the contaminated atolls. They conducted detailed medical examinations of all exposed residents. Blood samples, urine tests, thyroid checks, and comprehensive health assessments became routine. Every symptom was documented. Every illness was catalogued. Every death was studied. The initial group included 239 Marshall Islanders and 28 U.S. personnel who were also caught in the fallout. But the Americans received immediate medical attention and were evacuated quickly. The Marshallese became long-term research subjects. For the next several decades, they were examined, tested, and studied like lab animals in a massive human experiment. The results of this research program were scientifically valuable and morally horrific. The data clearly showed dose-response patterns in radiation exposure. Children who were exposed developed thyroid problems at much higher rates than adults. Thyroid cancer, hypothyroidism, and thyroid nodules became epidemic in the exposed communities. Growth retardation was documented in boys who received high doses. The medical literature was enriched with decades of data on human radiation effects, but the human cost was staggering. Entire families were destroyed by cancer and other radiation-related diseases. Traditional ways of life were shattered as contaminated atolls became uninhabitable. Fishing grounds that had sustained communities for centuries were too radioactive to use. The social fabric of these isolated communities was torn apart by illness, death, and displacement. The controversy deepened in 1957 when U.S. officials declared Rongelap safe for resettlement. Despite knowing that significant contamination remained, they encouraged residents to return to their home atoll. The official justification was that radiation levels had decreased to acceptable levels. The unofficial reality was that having people living in a contaminated environment provided ongoing research opportunities. The residents who returned to Rongelap continued to be studied intensively. Their diets were monitored because locally grown food still contained radioactive isotopes. Their health was tracked through regular medical examinations. Their exposure to residual radiation was measured and documented. They became unwilling participants in a long-term study of chronic low-level radiation exposure. This arrangement continued for nearly 3 decades until 1985, when the people of Rongelap had had enough. Citing continued contamination and persistent health problems, they evacuated themselves with help from Greenpeace. The U.S. government protested, insisting the island was safe, but the residents refused to return. They had become convinced they were being used as test subjects rather than being protected as citizens. The declassified documents from this era reveal the ethical framework, or lack thereof, that guided these decisions. Internal memos discuss the research value of continued monitoring. Scientific reports treat human suffering as data points. Medical protocols focus on gathering information rather than providing treatment. The line between medical care and human experimentation becomes impossible to distinguish. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments later investigated these events and reached nuanced conclusions. They found no evidence that the initial exposures were deliberately planned for research purposes. The Castle Bravo test really was more powerful than expected. The fallout really did shift direction unexpectedly. But they also concluded that once the exposures occurred, the U.S. had an ethical obligation to study the effects. The problem was how that study was conducted. Consent was never properly obtained from the Marshall Islanders. They were never fully informed about the risks they faced or the purposes of the ongoing medical examinations. They were treated as research subjects rather than as patients deserving care. Language barriers and cultural differences were used to justify withholding information rather than ensuring informed consent. The research protocols themselves reveal the problem. Project 4.1 was designed as a scientific study first and a medical care program second. The primary goal was gathering data about radiation effects, not treating radiation victims. When treatment conflicts with research objectives, research usually wins. When informed consent might compromise data collection, consent was avoided. The timing of various decisions supports this interpretation. The 1957 resettlement of Rongelap occurred despite known contamination, partly because having people living in a radioactive environment provided valuable research data. Diet restrictions were imposed not just for safety, but to control variables in the ongoing study. Medical examinations were scheduled to coincide with research objectives rather than patient needs. The financial arrangements also tell a story. The U.S. spent enormous resources on the research program, but relatively little on actual medical treatment for radiation victims. Detailed studies were funded generously, while basic health care for affected communities was chronically underfunded. The priorities were clear in the budget allocations. The long-term health outcomes documented by this research program paint a devastating picture. Thyroid disease rates in exposed populations were dramatically higher than in control groups. Cancer rates increased significantly, especially in children who were exposed. Reproductive problems, developmental delays, and other health issues plagued these communities for generations. But these health outcomes weren't just tragic consequences of an accident. They were also valuable scientific data that advanced understanding of radiation effects. The knowledge gained from studying the Marshall Islanders influenced radiation protection standards, nuclear weapons policy, and medical treatment protocols. The suffering of these isolated Pacific communities contributed to scientific knowledge that benefited the rest of the world. The compensation framework established in 1986 under the Compact of Free Association acknowledged some U.S. responsibility but fell far short of justice. A $150 million nuclear claims fund was created, but it was quickly exhausted by legitimate claims. Many victims never received compensation. Many families affected by radiation exposure were never recognized as victims. The legal framework treated this as a standard tort case rather than a human rights violation. Victims had to prove direct causation between their illnesses and radiation exposure, a nearly impossible standard given the long latency periods of radiation-related diseases and the multiple sources of exposure. The burden of proof was placed on victims rather than on the government that caused the harm. Recent declassifications have revealed more details about the decision-making process during this period. Internal communications show awareness of the ethical problems, but also show how those concerns were subordinated to research objectives. Scientists worried about consent issues, but proceeded with studies anyway. Military officials recognized the unfairness to local populations, but prioritized national security interests. The broader context of Cold War nuclear testing makes these events even more troubling. The Marshall Islands weren't the only location where populations were exposed to radiation from weapons testing. Atmospheric testing in Nevada exposed downwind communities to fallout. Nuclear facilities across the U.S. released contamination that affected local residents. The pattern was consistent. National security priorities trumped public health concerns, but the Marshall Islands case stands out because of its systematic nature and long duration. This wasn't a single accident or oversight. This was a decades-long program that treated an entire population as research subjects. The isolation of the Marshall Islands made oversight difficult and resistance nearly impossible. The residents had no political power and few advocates in the U.S. political system. The scientific legacy of Project 4.1 continues to influence radiation research today. Studies of the Marshall Islanders provided fundamental data on radiation dose-response relationships. This information guides current radiation protection standards and emergency response protocols. The knowledge gained from their suffering continues to shape policies that affect millions of people worldwide. The human legacy is more complicated. Survivors of the fallout and their descendants continue to deal with health problems that may be related to radiation exposure. Traditional life patterns in the Marshall Islands were permanently disrupted. Trust between the Marshallese people and the U.S. government was severely damaged and has never fully recovered. The question of deliberate exposure versus accidental exposure, followed by unethical research, may never be definitively resolved. The declassified record suggests that initial exposures weren't planned, but subsequent decisions about evacuation timing, resettlement, and medical monitoring were influenced by research considerations. Whether this distinction matters to the victims is questionable. In 2019, new documents surfaced suggesting that Project 4.1 wasn't just studying radiation effects, but also testing potential medical countermeasures. Experimental treatments were apparently administered to some subjects without their knowledge or consent. The Marshall Islanders weren't just unwilling research subjects in a study of radiation damage, they may have been unwilling test subjects for experimental radiation treatments as well. And those documents? They're still mostly classified, sitting in government archives, with redactions that hide whatever else was done to these people in the name of science.